Right, so welcome everybody to the history movies we would like to see. We have some great history podcasters who are going to be presenting scenes or stories from their podcasts that could be made into movies. So I will hand over to Colleen to present her ideas.
Okay, here we go. So the person I believe that we should have a movie about is Robert Smalls. He was an enslaved African-American man who is most known for stealing a ship called the Planter that he had previously piloted for the Confederacy, obviously as an enslaved person. Now, while there have been Civil War stories told in movie form for over 100 years, I believe this story is unique. So he planned and pulled off a major escape. He started out before sunrise with police and military guards nearby. He traveled upriver to pick up his family members and the other families that are joining them, and then headed back south towards the mouth of the Charleston Harbor, where he passed numerous forts and artillery batteries. He gave the correct signals that were needed to pass certain points, and he finally made it to the Union blockade near the opening of the harbor, where he likely would have been blown to smithereens if someone on the Union ships hadn't seen the white sheet that they raised. During the war, he helped influence Abraham Lincoln and other leaders to allow African Americans to join the U.S. Army. By the end of the war, almost 180,000 Black men had served in the Army, and about 19,000 Black men had served in the Navy. Smalls himself piloted several ships, including the Planter, during the war. After the war, he was granted a Navy pension, a Navy captain's pension. And while his daring escape would be a major point in the movie, I think many more things could be shared. Some of the things that could be brought up is his mother and grandmother's lives, even if it's briefly. They were all Gullah Geechee people, which are people who descend from enslaved people who were on plantations in the lower Atlantic coast. These people were able to hold onto their culture from Africa more than those who were enslaved elsewhere in the Americas. I picture sort of like the older stuff happening, like the older Gullah Geechee, and then also by the end of the movie, sort of like what time is, what it's like now, sort of a thing, and maybe like include his descendants. So back to Smalls. After the war, his life was far from quiet. He was a delegate in the South Carolina at the South Carolina Constitutional Convention, member of the South Carolina House of Representatives and the Senate, and he was also a school commissioner during this time. And from 1882 to 1887, with a year off there, he was also a U.S. representative in D.C. Now, he helped create legislation to make school mandatory for all children in South Carolina. He was also a member of the school board as well, and member of the state militia. He got a nickname, General Smalls, because of being in the state militia. And one of his main jobs was collector of customs in Beaufort, South Carolina, practically until his death. And I feel like I'm just rushing through this, sorry, but we're going to go on to the next slide. While this movie will show some of the horrors of slavery, this won't be the main point of this movie. Journalist and storyteller Tina Charisma writes, Black pain on screen represents a one-sided horror of Black history and life void of joy, laughter, and resistance of the Black experience. Alternative narratives of the Black experience, ones that evoke joy and happiness, deserve to be celebrated and seen too. Focusing on films that offer uplifting stories and include the positivity positivity of Black experiences is not a denial of the atrocities that have occurred in Black history. Rather, they help to create nuanced perspectives about love, hope, triumph, and most importantly, joy. So there is a production company called Legion M. They're a fan. They allow fans to help fund projects, and they're in the early stages of creating a film or a TV show about Robert Smalls. They're starting out by making a graphic novel, but they're already working with screenwriters and producers on making this film. There's a quote from the screenwriter. His name is Rob Edwards. He's actually kind of famous. He's known for Princess and the Frog, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Full House, and other productions. He says, every time you hear stories like this, you hear about the pain of slavery, and there will be a lot of that, and then there will be an escape. And then the end of it is, oh, good, he's free. But nobody ever talks about what happens afterwards. The world of Black America changes. Doctors, lawyers, millionaires came out of nowhere. Robert Smalls was key to that. He was the embodiment of all the great things that were happening during Reconstruction. So this Robert Smalls is really, truly a great story. And I do hope that this story is made.
That was great, Colleen. Thank you very much. We do have a quick question. Have you had any thoughts on the cast? I mean, who would you cast as Robert Smalls? Or was that a bit of a swerve ball?
I totally forgot to totally forgot that. I don't know if my brain is not working right now on that. Yeah. I totally forgot that part. I'm sorry, guys.
Not to worry at all. Not to worry. Great. Well, thank you very much. And let's hand over to Andy for a story from Africa, I believe.
Yes, hello. So I have a strangely, in a way, kind of similar approach, because it is a story which involves a Black protagonist, which is a bit more on the uplifting side, though also involves some pain as well, but in a bit of a interpersonal manner as opposed to an oppressive manner. Are you guys able to see my screen? All right, there we go. Now, this is the story of a man named Owusu Ansah, and he is an incredibly, incredibly fascinating figure. So a little bit of context about the time that he was born into. So he is actually born as the son of the Asantehene, which is the king of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa in the early 1820s. This is a pretty tumultuous time. His father is a man named Osebonso. Now, in most cultures, being the son of the king would be considered a pretty big role, position you as an heir, but that's not actually true in the Ashanti Empire. It relies on a matrilineal system, so in fact, his cousins would have been the people who were next in line. Being the son of a king put you in an interesting spot where you were very close to the royalty, but you weren't an heir, so you had a bit of a position where you'd be able to be a bit more flexible in what you wanted to do. This privilege was taken away from Owusu Ansah at a pretty young age, though. He was actually given over to the British pretty early as essentially a diplomatic hostage, which was a pretty common practice. The British and the Ashanti go to war in 1821 over essentially Ashanti claims to domination over the coastal Fanti peoples. The war ends in a strange manner where the Ashanti win very decisively early on, and then they see that very decisive victory turned back a little bit at the Battle of Kadamansu in 1831. After that Ashanti defeat, they end up essentially in a long stalemate with the British, which ends in a sort of compromised peace in which a new border is drawn between British and Ashanti sovereignty at the Pra River. As part of the guarantee to this peace, the young Osebonso is handed over to the British as a hostage. And this is where his life starts to get really interesting, because he doesn't actually stay as a hostage in Ghana. He actually gets sent to Britain itself, with the idea being that his uncle wants him to be used in the future as essentially a cultural bridge. They want him to learn about the British so that he will be able to come back to Ghana and function as an ambassador, or just someone to be able to increase cross-cultural communication to allow for greater peace in the future. Now, when he's in Britain, he actually converts to Christianity, and when he comes back to Ghana, he ends up becoming a minister. He also meets his future wife, a woman named Sarah. Sarah Smalls originally, but she would go on to later be Sarah Ansa. Sarah is also an interesting woman as well. Her father was a Scottish man who had worked in Ghana as a merchant, and his wife was from the Fanti peoples. So with this family that they end up eventually forming, the Ansa family kind of, in just their heritage, ends up representing this sort of multicultural family of all the different major powers in Ghana. That is, he is Ashanti, his wife is part Fanti and part British. So it's a really interesting dynamic that they end up having there, that their own family represents a blend of all of the different factions that they are working with. Now, he ends up returning to Ghana and working as a minister for a while, and while he's there, he ends up meeting a ton of very influential figures, one of whom I'm going to actually talk about in a later presentation at this conference, King Hardy IV, who is I could go into him forever, but he is a Fanti social reformer and political reformer who ends up playing a huge role later in history in Fantiman, as well as the very influential philosopher and political thinker Africanus Horton, who is widely viewed as the sort of grandfather of Pan-Africanism as it is known today. However, he ends up sort of having a crisis of identity. And this is one of the most interesting things about him, is that he starts to have a bit of a crisis over his own identity and the role that he plays within the British and Ashanti empires. Now, he has been essentially working in the British Cape Coast for several decades by the time that he decides to move back to the Ashanti Empire. He has been, brought up with this idea that that the Ashanti, of course, his people are, civilizable, but not civilized, is essentially the idea that he gets brought up in. And this is an idea that he wouldn't fundamentally end up disagreeing with at any point in his life, but it would be one that he ends up changing his perspective on. In 1862, he ends up moving back to the Ashanti Empire because he starts to have a transformative view. He starts to see the increasing threat of British aggression against the Ashanti and starts to see that the British colonial mission in West Africa is a bit more disingenuous than they make it out to be. And it's fortunate that he moved back in 1862 because war broke out between the two almost immediately after in 1863. This war is another interesting one. The Ashanti end up winning this one pretty handily, and it almost completely ends the British colonial rule in southern Ghana. Again, talk about that in my other presentation, but it is a fascinating event, and well, turns out that diplomats will play a pretty big role, as they do in ending most wars. The Ashanti Empire is pretty short on diplomats. Most educated Ashanti were educated in the essentially the Islamic tradition. Despite the fact that the Ashanti Empire was not a Muslim empire, they had an educated Muslim minority, and these people were not very well able to communicate with the British. So Owusu Ansa ended up playing a very pivotal role as one of the few English-speaking Ashanti elites. He ended up actually attending the conference and being the main Ashanti negotiator to end the 1863 war. But perhaps the most interesting portion of his life comes after the Third Anglo-Ashanti War, almost a decade later. The Ashanti Empire ends up being governed by a guy named Mensa Bonso, who is a just pretty crazy figure in many different ways. He vacillates a lot between different points in his life and different political views. Early on in his life, Mensa Bonso ends up becoming pretty close friends and associates with Owusu Ansa, and Ansa influences him pretty greatly. Ansa ends up reforming the Ashanti Empire's political system in many different ways, mostly in an effort to try to limit some of the more brutal aspects of it. Particularly, the Ashanti Empire relies very heavily on the death penalty, which makes Ansa very uncomfortable as a Christian. The death penalty is used for almost every crime that isn't essentially, in the Ashanti Empire, there are two main forms of punishment, either the death penalty or being placed into punitive slavery. This very much bothers Ansa, who tries to reform it into a less punitive system, a more forgiving justice system. He also tries to reform the powers of the Ashantiene a fair amount to varying levels of success, tries to reduce the brutality of slavery in Ashanti gold mines to varying success. Ultimately, though, this plan ends up failing. It's a story with a bit of a tragic twist. Ansa gets kind of run out of town. There's eventually, with the Ashanti Empire kind of on the verge of collapse at this point, there is a popular uprising against Mensa Bonso in the form of this strange cultic movement that sees themselves as being the reincarnations of previous great Ashanti figures. And they believe essentially that the Ashanti Empire is beset by a cabal and conspiracy of witches who are to blame for all of the problems in society. Of course, someone like Ansa, who is seen as, obviously he's Ashanti, but he's seen as a bit of a foreigner with curious ideas, is immediately taken as a scapegoat and run out of town. Mensa Bonso himself also almost gets assassinated in an event that kind of scars him and turns him into a much more despotic person. So it ends in a bit of a tragic downside, but there's a bit of a happy ending at the end of this Owusu Ansa movie. Owusu Ansa ends up moving back to Cape Coast in southern Ghana and lives the rest of his life very quietly. No longer is he interested in political reform. He just lives quietly with his family and enjoys a happy final end to his days. Even if he was never able to achieve tranquility on the Gold Coast, he was able, with his family, to prove that such a thing was possible. That, in fact, despite the political tensions of the time and the political brutalities of colonialism, his family demonstrated that Fanti, Ashanti, and British people could live together in peace if the political will was there and if the proper ideology was there as well. Sadly, that idea was never actually adopted in the culture of the time, but his family sort of proved that it was possible. The movie, I think, the reason why I want this to be a movie, this is not something that you would typically think of as a movie. There's not a lot of action set pieces. There's not a lot of big fight scenes, but I think that it has very interesting themes of specifically Owusu Ansa trying to make a compromise between his different cultural influences. This is something that I think would resonate very greatly with many people within the African diaspora in the West, particularly people who move from Ghana to the West and end up finding themselves simultaneously separated from their original culture, but also trying to maintain it. I think that this would really speak to that theme, as well as speaking to the theme of essentially how colonialism happens and the people who try to prevent it. That's why I think this would be a good story. As for casting, I haven't thought about it. So you got me there. I haven't thought about casting either. So who knows?
Does look a bit like Morgan Freeman.
Yeah. So I would, when it comes to casting, one thing that I would really want to emphasize is that I would want to, I guess this is something I had thought about in casting. I would want to hire probably a British actor who had moved from somewhere in West Africa, because he was said in his life to have a very unique accent that sort of blended the Ashanti Tree accent and as well as speaking with he spoke English in a very British manner because that's where he learned English. And typically whenever American actors get on, whenever they cast American actors to play characters in Africa, the accents are pretty unconvincing all over the place. This was very infamously a thing with Black Panther and the Woman King, where the accents were everywhere, where different characters supposedly from the same country spoke with completely backwards accents that were not even related. So I would caution and say that probably there should be either a British or West African actor cast for this role as opposed to an American actor, just to try and get that accent, the problem of accents out of the way, because that is always a problem, and people who are familiar with these accents can find it quite distracting when they watch the movie.
Cool. Excellent. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. And it sounds like, and somebody did suggest that maybe there was so many parts to this that it sounds maybe it should be a mini series rather than just one movie. Great. So handing over to Brendan. Brendan, all yours. Sound back.
Yes. Hold on. Let me share my screen.
Idris Elba.
I
of
was
course.
also thinking Idris Elba, whoever said Idris Elba. All right, there we go. Okay. Dobro jutro, everybody. And I want to pitch to you the greatest movie you will ever see in your entire life. It has revenge, action, romance, giant set piece battles if you want. It's got everything. I'm, of course, talking of the story of Olga, Grand Princess of Kiev. So, Olga of Kiev was a Varangian princess. She was born somewhere between 890 and 925 CE, and at 15 was married to what? How do I change slides? There we go. Oh, there we go. Okay. She was married to the guy on the left there. That is Prince Igor Rurikovich the First, the Brave. Actually, maybe not the Brave. I think it's just Igor the First Rurikovich. Whatever. So, and they had one son, Sviatoslav the First, who you see on the right there. And she was married to Igor the First no later than when she was 15 years old. And to the territory that the Kievan Rus ruled covered about parts of Russia, parts of Ukraine, parts of Belarus in the modern day. So around 945 CE, she gets a letter from a guy called Prince Maul of the Derevlians. The Derevlians are a tribe that pay tribute to the Kievan Rus. It was a marriage proposal. Now, this was a bit confusing because Olga was already married, and she actually had a very loving relationship with her husband. But it turns out the Drevlians had killed her husband. Apocryphally, they had tied one leg to a bent down tree and another leg to a bent down tree. They released these trees and tore Igor in half. They did this because Igor wanted basically to charge them more tribute and they didn't want to pay it. Now, obviously, Prince Maul was proposing a political marriage here. And it's, you can imagine, a hell of a thing to learn that your husband is dead and that the killer wants to marry you. So, naturally, she said yes. She said, I would like for you to send your men up here and come and retrieve me, and then I can come down and I can mourn my husband properly. And she did so. She invited them all to send up his men, and she said, it's a custom here to bury you on your boats as if it's a palanquin. The Drevlins thought this was a great honor, and of course, with an aspect of arrogance, in Olga's own words, they went back to their boats. Olga had her men carry them up and dump them in a pit, where they proceeded to bury them all alive. Apocryphally, again, because this is coming from the Tale of Bygone Days, or the Primary Russian Chronicles, which are not super reliable, but it's a fun story, so whatever. She kneeled down and she asked the Drevlians if the honor was to their liking. You can only imagine what they replied. So, Olga went off and she sent another letter to Mal and said, hey, those guys never showed up. Could you send some more? And Prince Mal, not wanting to pass up marrying the Princess of Kiev, who, by the way, now as regent princess, controlled a massive amount of territory, so he'd become a very powerful man. He didn't want to pass up this opportunity. So he sent more men up, and Olga said, okay, you can meet with me, but first you have to bathe before I grant you an audience. So they all went to the bathhouse, and she locked the door and burned them all alive by setting fire to the bathhouse. There you can see this is a illustration. There's the guys on the left being burned alive, and there's Olga of Kiev ordering their execution. So again, eventually at this point, Olga said, you know what? I'll just come to you guys. So she and all her men went down. She properly mourned her husband, and they had a great feast to celebrate the couple who was about to get married soon and her arrival in her honor, and so on and so forth. Well, if you've seen the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, you know where this is going. She sorry, excuse me, I'm recovering from COVID. She had all her men wear their clothes under their armor, and they had a great feast. And then they killed between 5 and 11,000 Derevlians. Finally, they realized that they're not friends. And this kicked off the war of the Derevlian uprising. And Olga was a very successful military leader, and she was showing her son, who was 4 years old at the time, Sviatoslav I, all the ropes of being a military leader. So she eventually came upon the city of Iskorostin, which is today Korostin in northern Ukraine. And she said, "Why don't you submit to tribute? I have an idea. Every household must give me 3 sparrows and 3 doves." The people of Iskorostin were very happy to receive such a lenient tribute. They thought this was a very small price to pay, considering what she had done to everyone else and what they had done to her husband. And they brought her all her birds. Olga then proceeded to order her men to tie a piece of burning sulfur to every bird. And when the birds went down to roost in the city again, they burned the entire place down. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is the best movie pitch I've ever heard in my entire life. When are we going to get this made? Well, first off, we need to come up with a cast. I mean, with a story of so much revenge, action, romance, we need a cast, right? Well, get ready to have your mind blown because of a perfect idea. The Revenge of Olga of Kiev is told by the Muppets. Of course, we have Igor the First. He's going to be Kermit. Who could play Olga better than Miss Piggy? Robin, of course, is going to be Sviatoslav the First. And in every Muppet movie, you know how there's like just a normal human, like Michael Caine in a Muppet Christmas Carol. He's the only non-Muppet. Everyone else is a Muppet. Well, I think that should be Ryan Gosling. All right, I know you don't need any justification. We have a GoFundMe and link down below. We're gonna get this thing made. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Brendan. Yes, as a Muppet, what more could you want? Right,
Exactly.
Yeah. But last but not least, let's hand over to Sam for something from British colonial history, maybe, or witches.
No, it'll be British history. That took me by surprise. I was genuinely thinking like, oh, what could it be? Oh, I don't know. And
yeah, I was going Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, I was really curious. I'm gonna book the trend. I don't have slides, unfortunately. But the people I'm talking about are, well, most of them are fairly, their faces pretty well known. But I'm not looking at British colonial history. Because my podcast Pax Britannica is just it's literally, I finished the script actually today to end the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. The topic of the film I would like to see is the trial and execution of Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, it has been done. I looked this up. The last one, I think, that covered this was called To Kill a King in about 2001 and 2002. I've never seen it. I watched the trailer. It's very early 2000s. There's a lot of lightning sound effects, and he did it for love, he did it for duty, and Tim Roth plays Cromwell, and it kind of works. And so, just to get Bob's question ahead of time, Tim Roth would not play Cromwell, but I think he's old enough now that he could play Fairfax, and I think he'd be a good Fairfax. But anyway, the topic is, basically, after the First and Second Civil Wars, Charles I has basically upset everyone. He refuses to come to terms. He still thinks that somehow he's going to end up back on top. This is after, I think 4 or 5 years of civil war, then about 6 months of peace, then another 4 months of civil war, which includes an invading army from Scotland, planning an invasion from Ireland as well. There's been uprisings throughout the kingdom, and still Parliament is desperately trying to come to terms with him because they don't know what to do without a king. They need a king. They don't like this king, but he's king. You can't do much about that. Except the army and a few radical MPs say, actually, we have an idea. And so Parliament was purged of any moderates who would consider making peace with the king, because as far as they were concerned, he may be a king, but he is also a criminal. And he had waged war against his people. He had committed murder on a vast scale. The civil wars were some of the most devastating conflicts that England has ever faced in terms of percentage deaths and plague and disease and famine and economic disaster. It's all just, it's not a good time. So they decide they're going to put him on trial. And Charles is brought to the, I think it's a room in the Houses of Parliament, and he is put on trial in front of, on the authority of the people of England. And Charles laughs in their face because there is no such thing. The body of men who were picked to judge him were drawn mostly from the House of Commons. The House of Lords tried to get in the way, and the Commons said, we don't need you anymore, because for the good of the kingdom, for the good of the people, we are making this decision. So they ignore them. They overrule the House of Lords, and after all this is done, they abolish the House of Lords. So England's government has traditionally been King, Lords, and Commons. And at a stroke, King and Lords are cut out of the decision making. Now it's the Commons. And basically, Charles laughs in their face because he says, this is not a trial. You have no rights. You have no sovereignty. I am anointed by God. No man can try a king. It's basically a mess because they don't know what to do if he doesn't plead guilty or not guilty. And Charles refuses to, because this is a joke. This is a farce. What are you talking about? And so they go back and forth over, I think, 3 or 4 days of court proceedings, but it takes about just over a week for it all to come to pass. And each time they bring Charles into the court, he refuses to plead. And so they just go, well, okay, we'll just listen to the evidence anyway. And so they listen to evidence, they listen to testimony, listen to witnesses, and still Charles refuses to plead. And there is an argument that if he had pled guilty or not guilty, that would have been an acknowledgement that a revolution had taken place, that his authority was not absolute. And so they could work with that. That was a compromise in itself. If he would accept that he could be tried and pled guilty or not guilty, then they could proceed. He refuses to. So the court decides to condemn him. They condemn him guilty, and they condemn him to death for treason. Again, this is a revolutionary thing, because treason is a crime against the king. The king can't commit treason against himself. But no, their logic is that he's committed treason against the people, because he is meant to protect them. And basically, yes, he there's some suggestion that at the last minute, when he realizes he's pushed them too far, he goes, actually, I can plead. And they go, no, you're not allowed, you're dead. You're dead in the eyes of the law. You don't get to speak anymore. So they take him out, and a couple of days later, he is beheaded outside the banqueting house. And what I really like about this story is that it touches on so many different things that matter at the moment, especially in Britain. You got questions of the origins of sovereignty. Do we have popular sovereignty in the UK, or is our sovereign still decided by God in the form of the monarch? There's questions of religious freedom. The people putting him on trial are most of them are radical Protestants, but a lot of them have a certain amount of tolerance for other Protestant faiths. That is itself quite strange and revolutionary. They're up against other Protestants, Presbyterians, who have no tolerance for other Protestant faiths. There is one way to worship God, and if you're not doing that, you're a heretic. And then you have the Anglicans, or the Anglican tradition, who are horrified at all of this. And then you got the Catholics in Ireland, and it's a whole mess. And then you got questions of the rule of law versus rule of force. Charles makes a valid point that he is on trial because the army won, not because of any law he broke. And then you got questions of constitutionalism. There's a push at this period for a group called the Levelers, who are political radicals, who want to essentially bring in crazy ideas like universal suffrage, which is obviously insane, of course. They're treated as maniacs for even considering it. And they want a written constitution, also madness. And all of this, they are told that, yes, we will proceed with you, we will make this deal, draft out your constitution, and we will implement it. They do so. The army then ignores them. And so they're furious, and it almost leads to another revolution. And it also, like, with the eventual fate of the king, he's killed. He's king of England. The English killed their king. But because, you know, he's also King of Ireland and Scotland, the English killed the King of Scots and the King of Ireland, and they didn't get a say. And that basically leads to at least 2 more wars with Scotland and England. Yeah, sorry, Luke, spoilers. And it essentially asserts the dominance of England over Scotland and Ireland and also Wales in a way that was always very clear, but had never been fully made obvious on the field of battle with a lot of bloodshed. And then after that, we get the Commonwealth and Republic and the Protectorate and things like that. And yeah, in terms of casting, I'm just stuck on Tim Roth. I think he'd be a great Thomas Fairfax. Cromwell, I don't know. I actually think Luke could probably pull off Cromwell. Looking at him now.
Warts and all. Thank you very much.
Well, they can apply warts. They can apply warts.
Yes,
and as to Charles, I don't know. I just always see what's his face, Obi-Wan Kenobi as Charles. He was a great Charles. Unfortunately, he's a little bit dead, but we can bring him back for that. But yeah, thank you.
Well, they did for the actual film, didn't they?
Yes, and Bob, yeah, it does look terrible. To Kill a King, it doesn't look like a good movie.
Right. Alec Guinness. Yes, brilliant. Well, that was absolutely fantastic, everyone. I think all of these movies should be made, and it's a travesty that they haven't already. Well, although they have in your case, Sam, sorry. But I think we need more of that. Thank you very much, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. That was wonderful.